Hi, and welcome to Uniquely UCF Sociology, a podcast production of the Department of Sociology at the University of Central Florida. I'm your host, as always, Dr. Ramon Hinojosa. Uniquely UCF Sociology is a podcast that explores the research and creative efforts of those who are doing the good work of sociology. You want to know what sociology is and what contribution sociology makes to improving our lives? Well, then you've come to the right podcast. It's Uniquely UCF Sociology. Today, I'm speaking with Annie Jones, a PhD student in the Department of Sociology at the University of Central Florida. Annie's thesis research focused on self-identified incels, or the involuntary celibate, young men who believe that their so-called right to sexual access to women has been unfairly blocked due to what they see as a progressive turn in American society. Annie is broadly interested in race, class, and gender inequalities and has a particular focus on how forms of hegemonic masculinities are transacted in the dark corners of the internet. She's co-author and co-winner of the Best Graduate Student Paper Award in the Department of Sociology for 2022, an award that recognizes excellence in written scholarship. Hello, Annie, and welcome to the podcast.
Hello, thank you so much for that introduction. I feel like you don't even need me here for the rest of this. Hi, I'm Annie Jones, as you introduced. Just maybe start with a little bit about myself here. I just finished my second year here in the PhD program at UCF in the Department of Sociology. And as you mentioned, throughout my academic career, I've really focused my studies and research on power and inequalities, really interested in power. So specifically, I'm interested in the ways that power kind of functions in our day-to-day lives and compels us to act in ways that reproduces harm to others, not necessarily directly, right? So I focus my research on kind of interrogating values and processes that rely on exclusion, but that are in our everyday lives. So this is very interesting to me. I may be a nerd for that, a weird sociology nerd. But
No,
I am. Go ahead.
I think your work is fantastic, and I think given the current political and cultural climate, where you have people who feel disenfranchised and powerless, who may unfortunately be resorting to forms of violence, I think your work is very timely.
Thank you. And something that has really interested me recently, purely from just the progress I've made throughout my academic career, thanks to a lot of the work in this department, not just looking at these like explicit instances where we can really see power, but trying to find the power that's hidden in like the acts of the good guys, right? Or the status quo that it seems really mundane and not filled with power and not filled with exclusion. That's been really interesting to me. So taking these tools and looking at, for example, involuntary celibates, this really explicit kind of version of masculinity, and then taking what I learned from that and bringing it to the more mundane versions of masculinities, right? And seeing the connections there and seeing how power operates in our day-to-day lives. That's been the most fascinating part of this program, and I think where I want to continue my focus. And I'm definitely using that focus as I approach my dissertation work as well. So I'll say a little bit about my dissertation work.
Yes,
I'm
please do.
just in the beginning stages of this, so nothing is set in stone. But I'll be looking at the book bans that have been enacted across the country. And I really am looking at these with the goal of deconstructing this, what I see as contemporary backlash against social progress. So these recent book bans that we've been seeing are really justified by framing content that confronts racial exclusion or the fluidity of gender identities or non-heteronormative sexualities, non-heterosexualities. They're really framed as like inherently inappropriate for the average American child. So in other words, the social problem is occurring at this really interesting intersection where power based on dominant identities are intersecting to present what is deemed valid, at least in our K through 12 education system. But on top of that, some of the arguments against book bans also use similar frameworks that rely on exclusion. So are we fighting fire with what we think is the right method, but really reproducing the status quo through our quote unquote solution? So that's going to be, I think, again, weird to say it, but the fun part for me of that project.
And so looking at the book bans gives you the ability to sort of look at how power is transacted in particular institutions, correct?
Yes, and approaching this, seeing it as an ecosystem. So these institutions don't just operate at one level, right? So looking at every level that the institution is operating at, from the very top, right, policy, bureaucratic, to the back to the down to the everyday, right, the day to day, the people on the ground, and trying to really capture every level of that to get a whole picture of what's going on.
And it's interesting. I think you can't miss the fact that the book bans are targeted at racial inclusivity, at gender inclusivity, at sexual inclusivity. And so the message that the pundits are giving is that, we're trying to protect the kids from these messages that are inappropriate. But the reality is that these books are really about trying to be a more open and inclusive and equitable society by disseminating information about different viewpoints.
Absolutely. So that really is the tension there that you just highlighted. And then we have this cultural response to it, right? The way that people make sense of the book bans. And I think there's so much more too, right? There's astroturfing and money coming in, right? And different groups funding different ideologies to be disseminated in specific places like our lovely state of Florida, for example. I know Polk County has been, the center of some of these book bans, and we can track where some of that money is coming from too. So it's interesting to see who kind of gets swept up in this, from the very intentional, driven, ideologically driven goals that, for example, Koch brother, funded interest groups have, to the parents on the ground that are living in a world filled with politics and ideologies, and a state like Florida or Texas, for example, where these book bans are happening, where the quote unquote culture wars are really being talked about and happening on the ground. So we have a lot of people swept into this controversy, and a lot of different elements that I think really needs to be interrogated and broken down to see not just what's going on with the books, but how are we responding to social progress, to the Black Lives Matter movement, right, to the acceptance of transgender children, even to like talking about things that are real, like trauma and the Holocaust, right, and 9/11. Those books are being banned as well.
Yes.
So it's a big mess.
So when you say astroturfing, maybe you can give our listeners a sense of what that means and how it applies to what's going on today.
Yeah. So one of the things, I don't have, this is part of the research. All of the book bans are happening so quickly, but something I've been looking to kind of find which directions to look with the book bans is previous kind of culture war controversies. So I'm looking at the campus free speech controversies, for example, and looking at who's funding not only the speakers, but the interest groups that kind of fight for freedom of speech. And I'm reading a lot of research about that, specifically pointing to like a singular group of donors. But what they do is they spend money to make it look like it's a group of grassroots students, for example, on campus, just really wanting to fight for free speech. But in reality, when you pull back the curtain, you see that there's funding from interest groups with very specific goals in mind. So for some of these book bans, I'm finding groups like Moms for Liberty that are a brand new group that came out that say they're completely funded by t-shirt sales. But there's a little bit of a paper trail that shows that they're not completely funded by t-shirt sales. So tracking where that funding's coming from and saying, hey, this isn't just a group of parents that organically came up with this idea, right? This is more of a political strategy. And there are people funding and coordinating these efforts. So astroturfing is like the fake grassroots, right? The fake grass in the field of social movements.
I'm struck as you're describing this process that, to my ear, this sounds like investigative journalism, right? Look at the money trail, try and determine what these connections are. But you're doing this in the context of sociology. And how does that fit? We typically think of sociology as this staid social science with the old canon. And so how does that work?
I appreciate that question because I've been working through that myself. But in approaching this dissertation and trying to organize it, book bans are such a big topic right now, and there's so much happening that this is, I don't know if this is TMI or just the way my weird brain works, but I try to think of it as like a who, what, when, where, why, and how. And so when it came to the astroturfing and that piece that does sound a lot like investigative journalism, it's the who piece, and that's what it led me to, is figuring I have to figure out who, because I don't have there's not literature out there. So some of that is me investigating. But I did find some really fun, again, fun for my nerdy brain, qualitative methods that I would like to employ. So using quantitative methods on qualitative data to find astroturf groups. So having, all of the interest groups in a data set and using my qualitative methods to code them, do some cluster analysis, but then quantifying that and looking for patterns in that data to look for astroturf groups. So there are ways for me to use my sociological methods along with this kind of investigation that I'm doing to uncover the who of my dissertation. That's really how I'm approaching that.
Amazing. So this really is truly about the power elite, the power structures, and how their ideology tends to filter down to the so-called grassroots and then cause these movements that we refer to as the culture wars.
Yep. And one of my questions for so many different pieces of this is, are these feelings genuine, right? So are these grassroots feelings, or are they organically, forming from people interacting on the ground, or is this something that's been implanted, right, and funded? So that's kind of what I'm asking over and over again. Is this genuine? Are we genuinely worried about our students seeing offensive things in a book, or are we more worried that Black and transgender students are going to have more, exposure in the classroom? So what's the genuine concern here?
That is a really interesting question. And so, which groups are the ones that we are most concerned about?
Who's being represented? Whose concerns are we representing? And then what's the outcome, right? That's where that backlash component comes in. Are we moving backwards? When I talk to my students, social progress never happens linearly, right? We try to frame it that way, but it's really a back and forth. So where are we in that back and forth, right? Where are we headed? How many steps backwards have we taken from things like this, and how do we move forward?
And so this was also central to the thesis work that you did as well,
Yep.
where you were looking at incels and sort of their response to what they saw as, the progressive leanings of culture, and specifically the backlash to modern feminism.
Yeah, I've learned a lot since then, specifically that I kind of knew this already, but I learned more that this isn't new, right? Incels, maybe the term is new, right? And the framing is new, but the backlash isn't new. So even looking at Susan Faludi's work on backlash, I was kind of laughing. I was born in the 90s. So looking at, gender backlash from the 80s, like divorce is going to be the end of American society and things like that. Looking at even just like media messages that were really commonplace throughout history that were elements of specifically gender backlash, and making connections to what's going on today. So really seeing, again, the bigger picture. It's not just incels, right? We're talking about masculinities. It's so much bigger than a small group on the internet and has a history, right? So connecting it to that history and then back to seeing a way forward from that, having some sort of optimistic conclusion here. So using history to hopefully, and sociology to hopefully, provide us with some liberatory potential to break free from the gender binary, or, use less racial exclusion in our day-to-day lives.
So even in the book bans, you're seeing sort of masculinities as being at the root of what's happening. And so maybe you could talk to that for a moment.
Yeah. With the book bans, it's interesting because it's not as explicitly masculine as incels were, because they were very much interested in access to women, right? But I think when we talk about book bans assessing masculinities as transgender students are framed. So how are we framing gender? And then how are we framing gender as it's connected to race and American citizenship, even what it means to be an American student? So it's not just, right, a white American student, it's a white cisgendered American student. So, and then we know masculinities relies on cisgenderism. I don't know if that's a word, maybe I just made it up. But masculinity relies on this system, this binary gender system, right, to perpetuate. So this attack on transgender students and even their existence in a book, right, says a lot, not just about gender, but about masculinities and this really deep hold our traditional gender binary has on us, where, you know, one book with one student who breaks that binary can cause total chaos in a school system or at a school board meeting. So I think that says there's a lot to say about masculinities. There's a lot to say about power and control through gender. And I think it's specifically going to be through the way that transgender students and knowledge about transgender students are framed. And then again, connecting this to whiteness and citizenship and heteronormativity. I think that really brings it all together.
Oh, that is absolutely fascinating stuff, Annie. I'm really excited to see the completion of your dissertation work, just so I can read what you've found.
Thank you.
If we could talk a little bit about the Graduate Student Paper Award that you just
Yes.
won.
Yes.
You know, you co-authored this and you won an award for it. So tell us about the award and, you know, the idea and how this came about.
I am so glad that we're doing these questions are coming up, because I feel like this story needs to live somewhere. We've been working on this paper for a very long time, and I'm sure, as you know, there are stories there's a story behind that paper you work on for a couple of years. So my co-authors, Vernon Headley, Dr. Shannon Carter, and I submitted our paper titled Beyond the Positivism, Non-Positivism Binary as a Step Toward an Inclusive Sociology for our department's Graduate Student Paper Award. And this paper was really born out of conversations that we had between my cohort, I, and Dr. Carter in our classical sociological theory course. So literally we had the class, and then like a week after the class ended, Dr. Carter, Vernon, and I were like, okay, we have to do something with these conversations. And so one of the themes that came up in this class, and if other sociology students are listening to this, or faculty who went through grad school, one of the themes that comes up in that classical theory class, right, is the distinction between positivism and non-positivism, and the epistemological foundations, and how they really shaped our discipline, right, and the foundation of our discipline and how we got to where we are today. And we can see that in our emphasis on quantitative methods, right, today even, and how qualitative works are like trying to slowly breaking through, but are definitely seen in a different light than quantitative works. And so we started to question these labels, though, because they're very narrow boxes, and oftentimes, like, people in general and people who lived in like the 1800s weren't necessarily living their lives to fit into our boxes that we have today to label them with, right? So we started to question those boxes and be like, wait a second, couldn't this scholar be considered both a positivist and a non-positivist? Du Bois is a great example. That's kind of where we started with a lot of this. And we also started to question like the association of validity with the epistemological foundations as well. So what's valid sociology or what's not, depending on how you approach your work. And then finally, we kind of made these connections and started to see that marginalized scholars in our discipline's early years were excluded from our traditional canon using epistemological justification. So that's really where we started, from these conversations, these back and forth, and almost us challenging Dr. Carter, like, hey, wait a second, that doesn't fit though, and really talking through how we're framing people and their knowledge in our classical canon. I mean, it's a PhD level course, but this trickles down to the way that we teach intro to sociology, some of these themes. Sure, so we saw there something important to be said here. So, for example, one of the things that we focused on in these early conversations was W.E.B. Du Bois' early work, and how it was framed as me search, and he couldn't be seen as objective by our white kind of gatekeepers in sociology, because he was studying his own community. So it didn't matter how rigorous the methodologies were, right? It didn't matter. The epistemological foundation didn't really matter. but that justification was used as a mechanism for racial exclusion with Du Bois. And so we kind of took this and said, okay, what other marginalized scholars can we really see as using multiple epistemologies, and how does this binary between positivism and non-positivism really drive the way that we teach sociology? So in our paper, we take this and we really argue that our obsession with the binary is holding us back. And it's an obsession that belongs to the white male founders of the discipline that we have carried with us, and that's continued to hold us back. And we look at the works of early Black scholars like Ida B. Wells, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Charles Fisk, to show that marginalized scholars and Black scholars in early sociology specifically were not concerned with a positivism, non-positivism binary. They were concerned with social justice, right? And seeking truths to make the world a better place. So that binary wasn't a concern, and we can look at their works as these great sociological works that would be excluded in a canon that relies on these binaries. So we really make this case that this binary is a mechanism of exclusion. It's really holding us back. It's holding sociology back. The fact that we even take time to have those conversations in our classes, our classical theory classes, we're kind of arguing is something we should move past. They're exclusionary mechanisms for both people, but the knowledge, right? And so when you leave out huge chunks of knowledge from whole groups of people purely based on these justifications, we're leaving out the potential to like be better in sociology, to know more, to have more access to knowledge. So really framing this binary as holding us back from like the potential we have as a discipline.
Sure. Seems like a great irony here that the idea behind positivism is that you're going to use this objective approach to create science, and science creates knowledge. But what you're suggesting is that the overt focus on positivism was used to block people from actually doing science.
Yes,
that's crazy.
Scientific progress is potentially thwarted through all of these years, and even today, right? We're, like I said, we're still having these conversations. Like, what could we be spending our time doing that's more productive than that, right? We're having this debate that belongs to old, dead white men that founded our discipline in ways that we use today, but many ways that we disagree with, right? And we're actively working to shift and adjust. Why would we continue to have their argument? So really saying that not only is their argument wasting our time, it hurt sociology, it hurt science, it hurt the process of knowledge creation and sharing knowledge. So it really is a big argument we tried to make there.
Oh, that's amazing. When you think about the sort of the newer methodological tools like discursive analysis, narrative analysis, grounded theory approaches, or just qualitative research in general, all of that methodological tool or toolkit gets blocked if we're just focused on strict positivism, whatever that's defined as.
And there's a whole conversation to be had of whether any scientist can truly be objective, but maybe that's just me on my soapbox. But I think you spoke a little bit to this, the framing of objectivism as even possible, let alone the king of the playground is kind of, it contradicts itself. It contradicts itself.
Because the whole point of having education frameworks to be able to then start to ask incisive questions to drive a science forward is in itself a very subjective process, right? It takes years to acquire this knowledge. It takes years to develop these frameworks to be able to really look scientifically at social phenomenon or any social problem for that matter. And so I absolutely agree with you. Objectivity is certainly overrated.
Or maybe some combination of objectivity alone, right? And that's how we end the paper. It's not to get rid of objectivity. It's definitely overrated, but pulling from Patricia Hill Collins and saying why can't we take a both and approach, right? Why do we have to be either or? So taking an inclusive approach to this problem that we're seeing and saying hey, there's a solution. It's not to be exclusive in the other direction. It's actually to be more inclusive in terms of what we consider valid knowledge in sociology. And I think we're already moving towards some of that. But again, the way that we teach our classical theory, it doesn't necessarily align with the way that we're doing sociology today. So trying to readjust that canon, because it's not that there weren't people doing it, in early sociology times. It's just that we didn't include them in the story. So readjusting our canon to tell the story, not shifting not adding things that don't need to be there, but adding things that should have been there in the entire time, if that makes sense.
Amazing. And then I'm sure our listening audience is hearing this and thinking, wow, I'd love to get to graduate school and start, mucking around in some of these ideas and, helping to craft the future of sociology. And so for that listening audience, what would you tell them about grad school? What's it like to be a grad student?
I think the first thing, it's definitely a roller coaster. And that's why it's torturous, because there are so many different ways to answer, because there are so many ups and downs of grad school. I want to say first, I tried to make a very conscious effort, because I've said this multiple times throughout this conversation. I'm a nerd. I love this. I don't know if you can tell. I get excited talking about these things. So I will say I try to make the time to appreciate how cool it is that my job is to read and write and teach and have cool conversations.
And we love your enthusiasm, Annie. I absolutely love your enthusiasm.
How cool is that? That's the coolest thing in the world, at least for nerdy me. I'm like, this is what I'm expected to do every day. Wake up and read. Okay. So that is awesome. So if you are a nerd like me and you like reading and writing and cool conversations and you could do it all day, every day, grad school is for you. So I think I'm living a nerd's dream, and I try to make time to appreciate that, because grad school can be hard, right? And sometimes I lose sight of that excitement. So in other ways, grad school is very, very hard. Organization, prioritizing your time, balance, which kind of goes into the next question. You have to know why you're here, and you really have to have that drive, because I think it's really easy to kind of let things pile up. There's so much work to do in such a short amount of time that without that motivation and that excitement, I think it would be very easy to let things pile up. And then it's like, okay, well, I'm not going to, overcome this mountain, so let me go do something else. Which unfortunately, I've seen, and not necessarily in this department, just from talking to people my age in academia, that burnout is a real thing. So grad school is a roller coaster. There are these high highs, right? And there are these low lows. But I will say, and this may be my perspective, I do think grad school is one of the most fascinating places. Back to I'm not just reading and writing all the time. I'm always consuming information, and I don't think we realize how much we learn. Learning isn't something you feel when it's happening. So that's very fun and exciting to have these moments of oh my gosh, I've come so far, even in the past 2 years between the master's and the PhD, being able to see the progress I've made. That is so fulfilling. And then having people around, we're kind of going back and forth here, to share that energy and commitment with is really cool. So, my parents don't necessarily want to talk to me about incels, and my friends outside of grad school are kind of okay, but my faculty members will, my peers will, right? In class, there's questions that are related to my interests. So having this environment where that energy and the commitment from my peers and the faculty towards their work, and having that energy towards my work, creates this environment where there's always something to learn, always somebody to talk to that can teach you something, new ideas and connections to be made, that get brain tingles, good brain tingles. That is what grad school is filled with for me. So I know it's a little bit of a messy answer, but I think it's a messy question.
No, I think you're right. I think, and in the end, you're doing the good work of sociology. You're moving the science forward in a way that is oriented toward things like social justice, right? Creating a more equitable society for people. And I don't think that can be discounted. I think that that's amazing.
And doing that in that shared environment where other people have those similar values and goals. I don't know if there's other environments that can match a sociology department. I think it's a very unique, very, very unique space, but a space that I absolutely love.
So where do you go from here? So after the PhD, what do you think you'll go on to do with this degree?
My main goal is to teach, and that has kind of been my goal since I was a little kid, and I don't even think I knew it then. I was printing out math tests for my little sister to take when I was 7 and stapling them and forcing her to take them, proctoring the exam and everything. So I think that I've always been drawn to teaching, and sociology is so exciting for me. So teaching really is my dream job. Like I said, this is the coolest job in the world that we get to read, write, and teach. So I definitely want to continue with this momentum and share that with others, right? Especially our young undergrads and even younger than that, talk about energy and excitement and questions about the world. I love those interactions. And so I kind of been slowly working towards that through, obviously, for other grad students know this, right? Some of us teach in TA just because it's the process of the PhD, and some of us teach in TA because we want to do it forever. And I'm in the second group. So UCF is really, the department has helped me. And I know I'm jumping into the other question. I'm sorry, but they fit so well together. Is how the department has, the next question was how the department has helped me achieve my goals. And it really has been through my entire time in the program, through that experience TAing for faculty, right? Who taught me the back end of managing a class or dealing with the fun situations that arise when teaching undergrads, and having that experience to really get to observe and kind of see okay, here's how other people handle this, and I could handle that situation. And then more recently, I have been teaching my own course, which has been so exciting. I am teaching it for the third time this summer. I got summer B though, so I don't do it till later. But I'm teaching our sex and gender and society class, our undergrad class. So spring and fall, I did that. That has been the highlight of the program for me. It really has. It just by far, the days I go teach are the days that I have the least stress and I'm the most excited about. It really is.
And your students are very lucky to have you in the classroom. I can't think of somebody better qualified to teach than you are. And so I think that's amazing.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
And so for those who are listening and are thinking about graduate school, if you could give them a piece of advice, what would you say to them?
Ooh. Okay, can I give two pieces of advice? Because one,
absolutely.
Well, the first one I give to everybody is get funded. Don't pay your way. Go, be funded. You have to be able to survive while doing this. Your survival is priority. So that's kind of the practical advice. But I think my more kind of ideal advice would be really have an open mind. I've mentioned learning so much. I did not expect for me to be where I am right here. And it's only through really accepting that all of the opportunities to learn, having all of those conversations, right? Having an open mind and really letting myself go where I was heading towards, as opposed to pushing myself in a direction or let somebody else push me in a direction. I am where I am today because of this really organic progress that I've made. And I would definitely suggest anyone else in grad school to kind of have that approach with a little bit of flexibility and open-mindedness, because you don't know where you're going to end up, and it may be somewhere you're really, really excited about, but that you couldn't have anticipated. So that really is my big advice.
Absolutely. So get on the path and stay there. You never know where it's going to lead, but it will probably lead somewhere good.
Yes.
All right. Well, Annie, thank you for your time today. Really appreciate you sitting down and talking with us.
Oh, thank you for inviting me on. I really appreciate it.
So I'd also like to thank you, our audience, for taking time from your busy day to listen in as we discuss all things that are uniquely UCF sociology. This is Dr. Ramon Hinojosa saying thank you, and we hope that you'll join us next week.